Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Folks seem to enjoy the cantrips tier list, so today we're coming back with level 1 spells, which is, again, just like cantrips, because you get these so early, probably the most important spell selection that you're going to make in the game. The use of level 1 spells, of course, stays relevant throughout the entire game, because level 1 spells can be cast with any spell slot, but no higher level spells can be cast with level 1 spell slots. So at any point during the game, you will always have spell slots that can only be used for level 1 spells. So it's important to take ones that are extremely relevant, both at early levels and at late levels. Which spells you take is going to change sometimes over the course of the game, either because you're a prepared caster and will stop preparing situational level 1 spells, or because you are a spontaneous caster and will swap which spells you know using the replace spell feature as you level up. The most common example of this is going to be sleep, but I'll talk about that a little more later. For now, let's jump in and I will talk about the tiers. So, I've divided these once again into 5 tiers, although I have changed the nomenclature very slightly from the cantrips tier list. In S tier, I have spells that are critical, and I'm going to be using this tier fairly sparingly because level 1 spells are actually very well balanced. I know that's a hot take, but the interesting thing about level 1 spells is other than a few that are mostly for role-playing or a few that are damage spells that just do less damage than the other options, the level 1 spells all have lots of utility uses, and so there are situations where pretty much all of these can be good. That means that there are almost no spells that you absolutely have to take, and there's almost no spells that you really, really shouldn't take. So you'll notice the complete lack of an F tier here. So the S tier I'm going to reserve for spells that are, I think, genuinely core to the character, ones that you will actually be crippling your character if you don't take. Typically that means that like the best damage spell in a tier is not going to make it to S tier. The best level 1 damage spell for a class is not going to make it to S tier, because doing 2 less average damage does not ruin your character, right? That said, there are a couple spells that are really, really powerful and that I think you really should not leave home without. In A tier, we've got great spells, and I expect this to be a fairly large tier because a lot of these spells are great. In B tier, we've got useful spells, which you probably won't use every adventuring day, but you can often prepare them for certain situations, or just are very powerful when they do come up, or just nice role players that will fill a marginal use for your character. In C tier, we have marginal spells. I guess I said marginal already, but useful spells will fill a use very frequently, whereas these more marginal spells are going to fill a very specific niche, one that doesn't come up very often, but maybe they do it very well, or are going to be spells that are, generally speaking, not worth taking because they're less powerful than other options, but still can be useful. And in D tier, again, I expect this tier to be quite small, are spells that are mostly just overshadowed by the other options, other than a few marginal uses. I think that there's been a little bit of confusion about the tiers, so I want to emphasize that every spell on this list has uses. Just because I say a spell is weak does not mean that there's no uses for it. And as a result, and similarly, just because I put a spell in like B tier spells are still good. So even if your favorite spell shows up in B tier, that still means it's a good spell, don't worry. I did get some of the most insane comments that I've gotten on my cantrips tier list. So, everyone keep it cool in the comments. Alright, let's go and talk about the spells. If you want to look up the exact text of these spells, I recommend going to the Baldur's Gate wiki. I'll link it in the description, and looking up the exact text. But first off, we have Animal Friendship. Animal Friendship is the equivalent of Charm Person, but for animals. You can cast it on a beast or animal that has intelligence 3 or less. So actually, one of the harder animal fights in the game, they actually have higher intelligence, and you cannot use Animal Friendship on them. And what it does is makes the enemy make a wisdom save or be unable to attack you for 10 turns. It also, in dialogue with animals, you can use it similarly to friends or charm person to gain advantage on charisma checks. If you also have speak with animals, then you can use animal friendship as a pseudo charm person for animals to gain advantage on dialogue checks. Generally speaking, Speak with Animals will just auto-pass all of the dialogue checks. There's very few where you need to both have Speak with Animals and have actual dialogue skills to get through the checks, so that use doesn't come up very often, and it means burning an actual level 1 spell slot on it. If you're going to do that, then you probably want to use Friends or something like that instead. Animal Friendship comes up very infrequently, and even when it does, it's not that powerful in effect. Just charming one enemy to get it out of a fight, or more if you spend higher level spell slots, is just not that powerful in effect. There's like 1 or 2 encounters where it could be worth it to prepare this, but overall you're better off with a real disable that's going to actually drop the enemies out of combat. So I'm going to say that Animal Friendship is a weak spell. Armour of Agathys. Armour of Agathys gives you 5 temporary hit points, and as long as you have any of those remaining when an enemy hits you, they take 5 damage. But importantly, as you cast it at higher levels, both of those things go up. So you get more temporary hit points, up to 30 as a level 6 spell, and do more return damage as enemies hit you. This is really important for Warlocks because Warlocks always cast their spells, and this is a Warlock spell, at the highest available level. Since they only have their Warlock spell slots, they're always going to be using the highest level version of Armour of Agathys. That means they're not spending anything more to get more hit points and more damage return out of it. Armour of Agathys on its own is not like the most impressive damage or anything like that, but it combos extremely well with certain builds. One is anything that provides damage reduction, like Heavy Armor Master, like Abjuration Wizard, or like Blade Ward. You can multiply the efficiency of the temporary health you're gaining and make the damage return apply that much more often. Secondly, it's also just a reasonable option for Warlocks, even if you're not trying to do anything fancy with it. A Warlock at level 5, just having 15 extra health and getting 15 damage, is often worth a spell, and it will last you the whole day. It's a spell that lasts all day, that you can use a short rest spell slot to cast. Because it will usually be freely upcast, and because it's so powerful in certain builds, and because generally it's just a good spell overall, just to have, Armour of Agathys is one of those spells that you will never be sad to have on your Warlock. You'll use it for certain encounters, and maybe not use it for other encounters, but it's just a great spell overall, so we're putting it in A tier. Obviously, it's critical to like the damage return builds. If you want to talk about a build that requires Armour of Agathys, then go look at my Invincible Tank Wizard build, which uses Armour of Agathys, I think amongst the best in the game. And obviously for that build, it's a core spell that it would be S tier, but as a general use case, Armour of Agathys I think is an A tier spell. Arms of Hadar. Arms of Hadar is a AoE, 10-foot AoE surrounding the caster, also a Warlock spell that does 2d6 of necrotic damage and prevents enemies from using their reactions for 1 turn. This is very low damage for a level 1 spell, but Arms of Hadar does have one kind of cool thing going for it, which is that it's a strength save. That's an unusual save to target, and some enemies will have very low strength saves. Archers and mages and so on will typically have very low strength, and so you can fairly reliably cast it on them. The main use for this spell would be to disable a counter spell by an enemy wizard by preventing them from using their reaction. But of course, the enemy AI will usually just counterspell the Arms of Hadar cast, which might be good enough anyways, since them counterspelling a bad spell is kind of equivalent to them counterspelling, to using this spell to prevent them counterspelling the spell you actually want to cast. But overall, Arms of Hadar is just weak damage for the level you get it at. It does not scale very well with levels, gaining only 1d6 extra per spell slot. The reaction prevention is a marginal effect, and targeting strength save is just not enough to save the spell. When you are looking at Warlock spells, you also always have to compare them to, is this spell ever a better use of my action than just casting Eldritch Blast? And the answer for Arms of Hadar is mostly it's not. It's going to do less damage on average than Eldritch Blast. So unless you're hitting a ton of enemies with it, it's actually going to be less damaging. And the Rider effect is marginal. Necrotic damage is a medium damage type, so maybe there's some enemies that it's going to be better against, but you always have to compare every Warlock spell to what if I just cast Eldritch Blast this turn, and Arms of Hadar is almost never going to be better than that. So this is our second weak spell. Bane. Bane is interesting because it is paired with, spoiler alert, one of the best spells in the game. Bane and Bless are equivalent but opposite. So when you cast Bane, it's a concentration spell that lasts for up to 10 turns, and it reduces enemies' attack rolls and saving throws by 1d4 in the AoE. It also has a save to prevent this effect from going off, but that save is a charisma save, which again is a really interesting save to target. Almost nothing in the game targets charisma saves, and there's a lot of enemies with very weak charisma saves, so Bane is more reliable than you might think at first glance. That being said, reducing enemy attack rolls by 1d4 is not usually going to save you. Enemies are either the chance that it reduces enemy hit chance by is just too small to be worth spending an action on. It takes your concentration slot, and they do get a save against it, even if it's one that they are relatively likely to fail, depending on what enemy you're targeting. The more interesting effect is that it reduces enemy saving throws, which you can use to land a more important spell, so you could try casting Bane and then maybe casting Hold Person from a second character. That being said, if you are doing that, generally speaking, you're better off just casting a real Disable and hope that one of them works. Like, if you have a Cleric casting Bane and then a Wizard casting Hold Person, it's probably better in most circumstances to just have your Cleric cast Hold Person and then your Wizard cast Hold Person, make them roll twice against the Hold Person, rather than give them a roll for a minor penalty against the spell that you actually want to land. Is Bane useless? No, it's definitely a powerful effect, but the chances of it coming up are typically pretty small, so I would generally avoid preparing and casting this. That said, there are some fights where it could be good. If you are out of level 1 spell slots, if your party doesn't benefit from Bless, or you just really want to land a specific spell, you could use Bane. I'm going to put it in C tier, but overall I would recommend against using Bane in general, because the chance of it coming up is fairly marginal. However, let's talk about its counterpart, Bless. Bless, also a concentration spell, also a 30-foot AoE, also lasts for 10 turns, but does the opposite. It gives you and your allies up to 3 creatures, plus 1d4 to all your attack rolls and saving throws, as long as you're concentrating on it. You might think, well, you put Bane in C tier, why would Bless be good? The answer is that hitting things with your attacks is very, very good, and you can pre-cast Bless before the combat starts. If you try to cast Bane, it's going to start a combat, so it always takes a turn of your character in combat to use Bane. Bless you can start before you enter combat, meaning that it does not take a turn in most circumstances out of your combat routine. This means that it's effectively a very cheap and very powerful buff that doesn't eat into your action economy as long as you precast it, and is therefore one of the best spells in the game. Giving yourself saving throws is better than reducing enemy saving throws usually. Giving yourself attack rolls is better than reducing enemy attack rolls almost always by a significant margin. And the fact that it does not take your action economy to use Bless means that it is one of the most powerful spells in the entire game. Do not leave home without it. We are putting it in S tier. I think there is basically no character that has access to Bless that won't want it. Burning Hands. Burning Hands is a cone shaped AoE that does 3d6 of damage with a dexterity saving throw for half. It is short-ranged and low damage, and it's a bad damage type. It's fire. There's, again, some circumstances where you might want Burning Hands, but in general, if enemies are getting this close to you, something has gone wrong for your caster already, and what you don't want in that case is a marginal amount of damage. What you want in that case is either the ability to leave, or the ability to actually shut down those enemies and stop them from ruining your character's day. Burning Hands is going to be less damage than most other damaging effects at this level. While it can hit multiple enemies, that won't be something that you'll usually want to try to do, because you would have to position your squishy caster too close to enemies in order to make use of that. And it's a dex save for half, and it's a bad damage type. It's a weak spell. Charm Person. Charm Person is a wisdom saving throw, very similar to Animal Friendship, but it works on people. That makes it way, way better, because there's a lot more people in the game than there are animals, and typically those fights are going to be harder. Enemies have advantage on the saving throw against it, though, which makes it much, much less reliable as crowd control. So you can use Charm Person to prevent an enemy from attacking you, and that is a very powerful effect, but they have advantage on the saving throw as long as you're in combat with them. So you could potentially cast Charm Person before combat starts in some circumstances, and that will prevent that enemy from engaging in the combat. And of course, Charm Person does also double up as a friend's cantrip, with the same rider effect that if you use it in dialogue to gain advantage on a charisma check, then the enemies will get mad on Tactician or Honor mode, so you can get arrested or get attacked as a result of using Charm Person, and it's much worse than Friend's cantrip for that use because it costs a level 1 spell slot, whereas Friend's is free. Charm Person, I think, is generally one that I would avoid for use in combat, mostly because the enemies have advantage on it. But the fact that it has 2 uses does make it a little more valuable to cart around. You can use it both for dialogue or for combat in an emergency, and the fact that you can precast it before combat to effectively crowd control one enemy out of that combat is kind of a nice bonus. So I will say that Charm Person is a C tier marginal spell. You could maybe bump this up to B tier if you don't have easy access to friends, or if you're playing on a lower difficulty where the enemies won't get, where the people you're talking to won't get mad at you for charming them. But overall, I think that Charm Person is not going to be one you really want to use. Just take friends instead and bring better CC spells for your crowd control needs. One of those crowd control spells that is quite good, actually, is a secret crowd control spell, Chromatic Orb. Chromatic Orb is an attack roll spell that does 3d8 of thunder damage or 2d8 of any elemental damage, acid, cold, fire, lightning, or poison, and if you use any of those options, it leaves a pool on the ground of that type. So it leaves us a ground surface. The acid surface reduces enemy armor, the cold surface creates ice, which enemies can fall over on, fire and lightning burn them, etc. This is secretly one of the best crowd control spells in the game, because in Baldur's Gate 3, ice surfaces are brokenly powerful. An enemy who falls prone on their turn loses the rest of their turn. So if you leave an ice surface under an enemy and they move at all on their turn, they have to make a dexterity save or just completely lose the rest of their turn. If they move back and forth on it, or if you throw them back into it, this can happen multiple times. This comes also with good damage. Chromatic Orb is 3d8 of damage, which is pretty much on par for this level. It's one of the best, or 3d8 of damage if you do the thunder damage, 2d8 if you do the crowd control, which is on par or excellent for level 1 spells in terms of single target damage. And the fact that it has massive utility in addition to that makes it an incredible spell. Also, one of the secret uses of Chromatic Orb, or I guess not so secret uses, one of the uses of Chromatic Orb is that it lets you choose your elemental type, meaning that you will never run into problems of an enemy resisting the element types. Also, of course, in Baldur's Gate, enemies who are wet take double damage from cold or lightning, so it combos with that as well, making it even more damaging if you can apply the wet effect easily to an enemy. with all of those uses together, even though it is primarily a damage spell, the fact that it has an enormously powerful crowd control component and gives you a ton of versatility on your character means I believe that Chromatic Orb is an S tier spell in Baldur's Gate 3 specifically, which is kind of funny because it's pretty weak in tabletop, where the surfaces thing does not come up. But the fact that enemies can just lose turns as a result of Chromatic Orb makes it incredibly powerful. Color Spray. Color Spray lasts 1 turn and is a cone that blinds an enemy, or an AoE spell that blinds an enemy. It blinds with no saving throw, and anything with no saving throw is is something that you always have to look at. The Color Spray will be able to work on a total of 33 hit points worth of enemies, meaning that enemies who are damaged are easier to hit. Enemies who are low level are going to be able to be blinded by this with no saving throw, even from full health. That being said, it requires you to be close to the enemy, and it only lasts 1 turn. Blind is a very powerful condition, so that's something that is definitely in favor of this spell, and I wouldn't say that this is a terrible use of your action. That being said, for a no-save blinding effect, you also have Fog Cloud at level 1, which if your use of the blind is just to gain advantage on attacking that enemy, Fog Cloud is going to be a better use of a spell slot in order to blind. The Color Spray, will force that enemy to stay blinded for a full round. There's no way they can move out of it like there is for Fog Cloud, but the enemies having disadvantage on their attacks for a level 1 spell slot and you getting advantage for 1 turn, is that worth it against weak enemies? Generally speaking, enemies under 33 hit points I'd rather just kill most of the time, so we're either going to be casting a spell that totally takes them out of combat, like Sleep, so that you can kill them in a later round, or a spell that actually helps you kill them, like Chromatic Orb, and I wouldn't recommend spending your spell slots on Color Spray. Again, not completely useless, and at low levels can be pretty good, but is overshadowed, I think, by other spells that do similar things, like Sleep and Fog Cloud, so I'm going to put it in marginal tier, but I think you could also easily put this in the weak tier. I'd be happy with either of those as a final pick. I think the fact that it has no save, and there's some cool stuff you can do with that by upcasting it at later levels is kind of interesting. And it does combo with some items that care about enemies being blinded as well. But overall, I would avoid using Color Spray most of the time. Command. Command is an interesting spell because it has 5 spells in it. It is a wisdom saving throw that targets a single enemy, but also targets an additional enemy for every level that you cast the spell at. So if you want to target multiple enemies, you can upcast the spell and hit more than one of them at once. It has 5 modes, really 4, but 5 modes: Approach, Drop, Flee, Grovel, and Halt. Approach makes them come towards you, Flee makes them run away, Drop makes them drop what they're holding, Grovel makes them drop prone, and Halt makes them unable to act, move, or take bonus actions or reactions, etc. In Baldur's Gate, Halt is just worse than Grovel, because enemies who are prone can't do any of those things anyways in Baldur's Gate 3, differing from the tabletop version of the spell, where there's a reason to cast both of those versions. But Command Grovel is the one you're going to be using the overwhelming majority of the time. Makes an enemy drop prone, which gives you advantage on attacks against them, and prevents them from doing anything for an entire turn. They skip their next turn. It also differs, interestingly, from the tabletop version of the spell in that they drop prone immediately on you casting the spell, rather than on their turn. And so you get to get advantage on the rest of your attacks that round when you cast Grovel. Command Grovel is one of the best crowd control effects in the game. It is a no questions asked. They just fail a save and they don't get their next turn, and you get huge advantages against them because all your attacks will have advantage. You also have other uses for it. Flee and Approach are not going to be ones you're going to use that often, but they do come up very occasionally. And Drop can let you get cool items from certain enemies, take away an enemy's weapon if the fight's going to go long. That's sometimes better than just making them skip a turn. You can reduce their damage output massively by taking away their weapon if you force them to drop it and then have somebody pick it up. Command is versatile and extraordinarily powerful. It's one of the best spells in the game. I would highly recommend against any cleric leaving home without it. We're going to put it straight into S tier. Compelled Duel. Compelled Duel is cool in that it's a bonus action. It's a paladin spell that in its description says it forces the enemy to attack you. It doesn't actually do that. What it does is it gives enemies disadvantage on attacking anyone but you. So while it is sort of soft crowd control on it does not actually prevent the enemy from attacking your allies. It also, that being said, it only takes a bonus action, so it doesn't have to be amazing to be good. So the question is, how good is that effect? The answer is not very. And one reason for that is just that paladins really want to not spend their level 1 spells on things other than smites, so Compelled Duel is just not a great use of a spell. Special mention, though, for Compelled Duel when cast by enemies, in which case it's the most crippling and most devastating crowd control effect in the game, because it makes your characters do boneheaded, moronic things. You lose control of them, and then they will do stuff like hurl bombs at the enemy and your entire party, run into melee as a wizard, etc. So, Compelled Duel, devastating when cast by enemies because of how it works in Baldur's Gate, not very good when cast by your party. I would put this in the weak tier, though again with special mention for the fact that it works completely differently when enemies cast it than when allies cast it. Create or destroy water. Create or destroy water lets you, as the name says, create or destroy a surface of water. This can be used primarily to get enemies wet, just like in all your fanfictions. One thing that's kind of neat about Create or Destroy Water is that it is one of the only level 1 spells that has a cantrip version. When you hit level 3 and get second level spell slots, you get a cantrip version of Create or Destroy Water, allowing you to cast it resource-free. This is super powerful. The wet condition in Baldur's Gate 3 doubles lightning and lightning and cold damage that enemies suffering from it take, which is ludicrously powerful. Doubling damage is not really something that should be in the game, and at least easily not something that should be easily available within the game, and it's the source of some of the most broken builds because it's based on sort of a house rule by Larian that does not have an equivalent in the tabletop version of the game. The fact that this allows you to give enemies vulnerability to one of the easiest to boost damage types in the game, it makes it ridiculously powerful, and so it's a core component of any lightning-themed build, any cold-themed build. It will want access to Create or Destroy Water. For characters that aren't trying to abuse the wet condition, it's still pretty good. Being able to have a water surface on the ground that you can freeze and make an ice surface is pretty useful. Being able to put out fires is pretty useful. There's one particular encounter where being able to put out a fire is critically important. In fact, 2 encounters that I can think of where you need to put out fires. And generally, the fact that it doesn't take a spell slot to do all these things makes it quite valuable. You can also upcast it with higher level spells if you really need a gigantic AoE of water. Usually you won't be spending higher level spell slots on it, but the option is there. I'm hesitant to put Create or Destroy Water in S tier because it is based on kind of an abusive rules corner case that I don't think was fully balanced when it went into the game, but I am going to put it in S tier because that is the game that Larian shipped, and as such, just the fact that you can so easily double damage from any of your allies with this, and you don't have to have a dedicated lightning build in order to make use of this effect. Any weapon with lightning on it, arrows that have lightning, just having a Tempest Cleric in your party, whatever, allows you to gain massive value out of Create or Destroy Water, and you really should not leave home without it. It is so much damage and also provides a ton of utility to your party. Cure Wounds. Cure Wounds is a touch range healing spell, melee range healing spell that deals 1d8 of healing to your ally. You can upcast it for a little more healing. Healings in Dungeons and Dragons and in Baldur's Gate occupies a weird position because the numbers on healing are bad. A d8 of healing is 4.5 average healing. An enemy attack is going to be on average about 7 to 10 damage at level 1. So you are never going to keep up with incoming damage by spending healing in combat. Cure Wounds is also just pretty inefficient healing out of combat. You spend a spell slot for d8 hit points. That is just not a lot of hit points to get, and there's much better ways to restore your hit points in between combats if that's something that you need to do. You will never want to spend an action on a d8 of healing. You'll never want to spend a spell slot on a d8 of healing. Just use potions, use Healing Word, which is a spell that we will talk about a little bit later on, and so on. Instead, do not bring Cure Wounds, because then you might accidentally spend a turn casting it, and that would be a problem. We're putting it in D tier. Disguise Self. Disguise Self is a ritual spell, meaning that it can be cast, as long as you have it prepared, it can be cast without spending a spell slot. So sort of like Create or Destroy Water, or like cantrips, it doesn't take resources to actually use it. It lets you turn yourself into a representative of another race, meaning that you can use it for all kinds of utility. There's actually a lot of utility to this spell in Baldur's Gate. I think they actually did a great job implementing a spell that's kind of hard to implement into a video game. Some things that you can do with it include pretending that you aren't the person who stole something, pretending that you aren't the person who killed somebody and is talking to them now with Speak with Dead, getting better prices from merchants by disguising as a member of the same race, using racial-specific weapons like the Dwarven Thrower or Githyanki's Silver Sword. There's a lot of possibilities with Disguise Self. I think there's also a couple dialogue triggers that specifically let you cast Disguise Self in certain situations, which is pretty cool in and of itself. This is a very powerful spell. You won't be crippled if you don't have it or anything. This is not a spell that is going to cost you tremendously to not have, but it's very cheap to bring along. I'm going to put it in B tier because I wouldn't say it is as strong as an A tier spell in terms of like getting you through certain encounters, but it's very useful in a lot of situations, so I would definitely recommend taking it. Dissonant Whispers. Dissonant Whispers is a 60-foot range damage spell that does 3d6 psychic damage, which is one of the worst damage types, and targets a wisdom save, which is one of the worst saves to target, because enemies will often have reasonable wisdom saves. That being said, the effect is very powerful. It frightens an enemy for 2 turns, preventing them from moving. And melee enemies who you will typically want to hit with Frightened are the ones who are least likely to have good wisdom saves. So that in and of itself is pretty good. It is kind of average damage for this level, save for half, but if they save, then you didn't get the Frightened effect, which means that you've wasted a turn and your spell on a very piddling amount of damage. But if it goes off, it can be very powerful, just fully taking an enemy out of the fight for 2 full turns. I think you probably wouldn't pick this on a Sorcerer or Wizard, because it's competing against Chromatic Orb there, but on Bard or Warlock, it can be one of your best options for just a damage and CC spell. Great single target CC. I'm going to put it in the useful tier. I don't think that you need to have it on these characters, but it is a totally reasonable pick, and one that will definitely come up in combat pretty often. Divine Favour. Divine Favour is a War Cleric or Paladin spell that takes a bonus action, lasts for 3 turns, requires your concentration, and gives you an extra d8 of damage on your attacks. Taking your bonus action is pretty painful for a War Cleric, so it's mostly for Paladins, because then you can't use your War Cleric extra attack as a bonus action. So the question is it worth a bonus action and a spell slot to get a d4 of extra damage? If you're making multiple attacks in a round somehow, this can be pretty useful, but in general, a paladin is going to want to spend their spell slot on a smite. 2d8 of damage all at once is going to be better than a d4 of damage 3 times, right? 3d4 of damage is an average of is that 7.5 damage, and 2d8 of damage is an average of 9 damage. So a smite is more damage in and of itself, and the smite happens right away, whereas you have to hit 3 times for Divine Favor to actually work. It also eats your concentration. Generally, I wouldn't advise spending a spell slot on this, but on certain builds that are hitting multiple times in a turn, for whatever reason, then you can get some extra value out of it. The fact that it also requires your bonus action, though, means that even on some kind of like dual-wielding paladin, you're not going to be getting the second attack with it on the first round you use it, and it eats your concentration, which means you can't have Bless or anything like that. I think that Divine Favor, again, not completely useless, but not a spell that I would recommend casting. I'm going to put it in the weak tier. Enhanced Leap. Enhanced Leap is missing from this tier list. Oh, no, here it is. All right. Just in the wrong order. I don't make these tier lists, so I'm learning as I go. Enhanced Leap is triples your jump. It's a ritual, which means you can cast it with no resources expended, and for 10 turns, it will triple your jump distance. This means that your jump distance can be enormous. Those of you who've watched my video on called The Owlbear Flies will see there's a bunch of really cool build-specific uses for Enhanced Leap, but also just the fact that it's a ritual spell and does not take an action means it's just a great spell. Mobility is incredible, and it does not require your concentration or anything, so you can precast this before a lot of combats and just gain a pretty solid advantage. I think this is definitely worth the spell slot in just normal day-to-day adventuring, even if you're not doing anything sort of particularly specific with it, like the Owlbear jumping build or whatever. Just making your characters more mobile. Enhanced Leap, if you precast it before going into combat, is like a better Longstrider, which is already one of the best spells in the game, because it means that you can spend your bonus action for like 40 feet of movement instead of 15 feet of movement, which is an incredible amount of extra mobility for all of your characters, and it's a ritual spell, so you can use it as many times as you want. If it wasn't a ritual, it wouldn't be as useful, but just the fact that it doesn't take a resource to use, doesn't require your concentration or anything, and gives you a massive amount of mobility makes this an incredible spell, even aside from the like speed running and specific build uses that it has, of which there are many. Ensnaring Strike. This is a ranger-specific spell that uses an attack roll and has a strength save. Strength save is another pretty interesting save, just like with Arms of Hadar. Targeting strength save can be pretty useful. And unlike Arms of Hadar, this does a very good effect. Ensnaring is one of the most dangerous crowd control effects in the game, because it just stops enemies from doing, like, basically anything. And gives you advantage on attack rolls and so on. It also does a little bit of extra damage at the beginning of every turn, an extra d6 of damage, and it is used alongside a weapon attack, so you're not actually giving up any DPS to use Ensnaring Strike. You can also, with the correct ranger favored enemy, get advantage or force enemies to have disadvantage on the saves against this, making it very reliable even with low ranger save DCs, which typically you won't have lots of wisdom on a ranger, so your save DCs will be medium, but with disadvantage the Ensnaring Strike can land pretty reliably. This is very powerful. It's a great CC spell and just a great effect that massively increases the damage output of your character because of the advantage, while giving you a bunch of extra utility on a character that doesn't normally get any utility effects. I love Ensnaring Strike. I just think it's a great spell. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's S tier, but it is definitely A tier. Entangle. Entangle, it's also a strength save, does the same thing, but instead of being an attack, it is a 10-foot radius that you place on the ground. One thing that's notable about this is that it is difficult terrain, so creatures that are immune to difficult terrain, like having land stride from being a land druid or a ranger, lets you freely pass through your own entangling effects. The best usage of Entangle is cast by the druid summon, but it's still a totally reasonable use of a spell. Making things difficult terrain is pretty good. It halves enemy movement speed while in them, and enemies have to make a strength save or become entangled, and a lot of and while the enemies that you really want to entangle will typically have good strength saves, there are some enemies in the game that will have pretty bad strength saves, and you can hit with Entangle. I think that Entangle is worth preparing pretty much all the time. It also gives you a source of flammable material if you're looking to make a fire surface. Not that that's something that's super in demand, but I do think that Entangle is a pretty strong spell. It does use your concentration, but it's one of the better things to use your concentration on. If you're a druid, like cast Entangle, then Wild Shape, maintain concentration on the Entangle. Just a very powerful spell overall. I'm going to put it in A tier. Expeditious Retreat. Expeditious Retreat is a bonus action, and you cast it and immediately dash, so you immediately get to move your move speed, and then you can dash as a bonus action until the spell ends. There's a couple cool things that you can do with this. One is just get away. Obviously, being able to run away is very powerful. You can use it to disengage and dash in the same turn, something that normally only rogues can do. You can also just use it to dash twice in a turn, moving triple your movement speed if you have Expeditious Retreat. You can also use it with builds that want to dash a lot, like the Barbarian Immortal Tank build I posted, just wants bonus action dashes, and takes levels in Rogue to get that. Well, you could also use Expeditious Retreat for that. Not something that I would recommend spending your concentration on, and it doesn't work in Rage, so for that specific build, it's not that great, but there are a lot of builds that just want to dash for various reasons, like to generate lightning charges and stuff. So that can be a pretty powerful use for the spell as well. Usually you're going to swap out this spell at level 3 when you get access to Misty Step, because it's just a better escape spell, bonus action escape spell. But Expeditious Retreat is very good in the early game, and one that can give you a lot of options. It also lets you kite enemies. If you are like Ray of Frosting and Expeditious Retreating them, they'll never catch up to you. So I'm going to put this in B tier. Faerie Fire. Faerie Fire is an AoE Dex saving throw spell that requires your concentration, and for 10 turns gives you advantage on enemies who fail the save and prevents them from going invisible. The second part is the really useful part, although advantage on attacks against enemies who fail the save is very powerful. It's less powerful on Tactician and Honor mode because enemies are just less likely to fail the saving throw in the first place, so you gain less expected advantage on higher difficulty settings. But it's still just a very good spell overall. A solid role player that you're going to want to bring on somewhere in most parties, whether just having it as a scroll, taking it on a bard, and then maybe swapping it out later, but generally most parties are going to want access to this because preventing enemies from going invisible is really good, and the advantage on enemies does come up in certain fights. You can use it to get sneak attack on your rogue if that's something that you're struggling with. I would usually say that you don't want to use Faerie Fire except against invisible enemies. It's marginal in most combats, but it's so powerful against invisible enemies, I'm going to put it in B tier. False Life. False Life is a level 1 spell that just gives you 7 temporary hit points. They last until you lose them. Temporary hit points don't stack, so that means that if you're getting them from another source, like Armour of Agathys, then you aren't going to gain any advantage from this. Unlike Armour of Agathys, False Life doesn't scale, does not scale for free because it's not a warlock spell. So you have to actually spend sorcerer or wizard spell slots on False Life. It gives you 7 at level 1, but only 5 extra for every higher level spell slot you use. So you aren't going to gain an enormous amount of bonus from casting it at a higher level if that was something that you wanted to do, which it probably shouldn't be. Spending a spell slot on a wizard for temporary hit points is something that you will want to avoid. Because it doesn't have the free scaling of Armour of Agathys, it is not going to give you a lot of hit points, and it's just not an efficient use of a spell. You are better off, and it will save you way more damage, spending those level 1 spell slots on other defensive spells like Fog Cloud to hide in, or Shield, of course, is the big one. A typical casting of Shield will save you way more than 7 damage, and so your level 1 spell slots are going to be better off spent on that, rather than spending them on False Life. I would generally recommend not spending this on False Life. If you don't have another source of temporary hit points a scroll of false life. I actually don't know if there is such a thing in the game, but if there is, that could be a good way to gain a buff before going into a major fight, is just cast a scroll of false life on yourself. But I wouldn't use an actual spell slot on yourself in order to gain 7 temporary hit points. Just not a great use of your resources. Featherfall. Featherfall is another ritual spell, meaning it does not require an action to cast, or does not require a spell slot, but unlike the tabletop version of Featherfall, it does require an action to cast. In tabletop D&D, you can cast it as a reaction while you're falling, meaning that if somebody like pushes you off a cliff, you could Featherfall on your way down. In Baldur's Gate, you have to know in advance that you're going to fall, meaning its primary use is for getting down from high places, faster without having to go through a bunch of loading screens. There's a couple dungeons that Featherfall can help with. If you Featherfall your whole party and then jump down, you can bypass a series of traps. Auntie Ethel's Lair is the biggest one for that, but there's a few others that you can bypass a bunch of traps with Featherfall with. It's also, of course, very important for speedrunning, if that's something that you're interested in. But the fact that you can't use it to prevent falling damage in response does hold this spell back from being a normal prepared spell. It's one that you should, again, always have access to somewhere in the party, because when it comes up, you're going to be happy you have it. But it's not one that I would say, like, you have to not leave home without. You can use potions or something for it as well if you really need it. I'm going to put it in B tier, but I think that's being a little generous. Find Familiar. Find Familiar is one of the cooler spells in the game because it, again, gives you a ton of options. You can find a familiar, which lasts all day. It's a ritual spell, so again, does not require a spell slot, but it will disappear if you unprepare the ritual. Unprepare the spell. Usually it's supposed to, it doesn't always. And you can summon a cat, crab, frog, rat, raven, or spider with the basic version of Find Familiar. The best of these is the raven because it has a blinding attack. The number of uses for Find Familiar are stratospheric. You can use it to threaten enemies. You can use it to scout. You can use it as a blinding attack because it's a raven. You can use it to go through the little cracks and stuff that the game allows you to scout with small creatures. You can use it to block doorways. The number of uses for a summon is enormous. The fact that it requires no resources, it's on a short rest cooldown, but doesn't take a resource to use, is incredible. Even if it just absorbs 1 attack per short rest, and that's the only benefit you get out of it, that's still really good. So Find Familiar is just incredible. The thing that holds Find Familiar back is that it's annoying to use. The AI does not really work that well with Find Familiar. It will sometimes not follow your character or get stuck in weird places, and you have to micro it in combat. But in terms of sheer power level, it's just an S tier spell. Fog Cloud. Fog Cloud creates an AoE in which things are heavily obscured and blinded. Fog Cloud differs significantly from its tabletop version. So in Baldur's Gate, in tabletop, it creates an area of full concealment, meaning you cannot see things that are inside it, which means you can't shoot them or target them with spells or whatever. In Baldur's Gate, you can still target things that are in the Fog Cloud, but they count as heavily obscured so they can hide. Fog Cloud is mostly useful for 2 things. One is putting it on top of enemies and blinding them. That's pretty good, because blinding enemies for a turn with no save, is basically as good as Faerie Fire, right? You gain advantage on your attacks against enemies if you put them in a fog cloud, and there's no save against that effect. They can leave the fog cloud, but if you have your initiative order set up well, then you will get a round of attacks against them before they can do that. Secondly, it's really good for rogues, who can bonus action hide inside the fog cloud, giving them a completely impenetrable hiding spot. You can have them leave the fog cloud, fire an attack, go back into the fog cloud and hide, and enemies will never be able to find them, and if they want to go into the fog cloud to find them, they'll blind themselves. So that gives you sort of a pseudo-darkness spell. Fog Cloud has a lot of uses and is a pretty powerful spell, but significantly worse than it is in the tabletop version. And in different patches, it's actually worked differently in Baldur's Gate, but this seems to be the version that they've gone with in order to differentiate it from Darkness. Because of that, I'm going to say that Fog Cloud is a B tier useful spell. I think it's good. I think you should bring it on most characters, or in most parties, because no questions asked advantage on attacks is just a very, very powerful effect. Even if it only lasts for 1 or 2 attacks, that can often be worth a level 1 spell slot because it requires no save. And unlike Color Spray or Faerie Fire or whatever, this is a completely condition-free way to gain advantage on your attacks. Just incredibly powerful for that use. But in general, it's not going to last more than 1 turn because enemies can simply walk out of it. So this holds it back from being a more powerful spell. If you are a solo character using Gloomstalker Ranger and Assassin Rogue to solo the game, Fog Cloud is a must-have because for you it is just a perfect hiding place that lets you do your thing with complete impunity from ranged enemies and makes the life of melee enemies harder. But don't put it on your team in order to prevent ranged attacks against you because you'll just blind them, giving enemies advantage. Goodberry. I think we are also going to have to split this video into 2 sections because it is starting to run long. I was like, whatever, I'll just talk a little less about each spell, but of course you can't make me spend less than 5 minutes per spell, so asking me not to talk a lot about D&D spells is a pretty heavy lift, I have to say. So we're going to split this video into 2 parts. So definitely keep an eye out, make any suggestions that you want to make, and I might change some stuff for part 2, but we'll do Goodberry before we finish. Goodberry is a druid spell that gives you access to 10 Goodberries, or 4 Goodberries that give you 1d4 hit points. So already as out-of-combat healing, it's better than Cure Wounds, which is kind of insulting to Cure Wounds, but it does more healing than Cure Wounds just by itself. Each berry also counts as 1 camp supply, meaning that if you do a build based on attempting to do this, you can spend your spell slots from 1 long-resting camp follower druid to infinitely generate food. So you never have to gain camp supplies because as long as you have a high enough level druid, they can make enough good berries to feed your party completely. You need 80 good berries, so you have to spend 20 spell slots on making good berries. Well, if you have enough druids in your party or high enough level druids, you can do that. And then at lower difficulty levels, you only need 40, so you'd only need to spend 10 spell slots. There are builds you can make to just infinitely generate supplies. I don't recommend doing that because it sounds awful. It just sounds like a nightmare to actually do, but something that is worth mentioning about Goodberry. Mostly this is just for out-of-combat healing, and I don't think that out-of-combat healing is something that's in short supply in this game. You could just use healing potions if you need it. So I would say that Goodberry is a marginal spell. The fact that it does give you a bunch of free potions is kind of cool, but it is not one that you are usually going to want to spend your spell slots on. The fact that it infinitely feeds your party is also pretty cool if that's something that you're interested in. I don't think that most players are going to be interested in that. But together, those two things do add up to enough uses that I'm going to say it's marginal. You could, again, easily put this in D tier, and I would not be opposed to that either. Alright, my friends, we are halfway through the level 1 spells, so do join me for part 2. I think part 2 is where these spells actually get really exciting. Something I'm noticing is that all the good spells or a lot of the bad spells start with letters that are early in the alphabet. The spells later on seem on average to be stronger, but I think we'll figure out whether that's true or not next time. As always, my friends, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and of course feel free to leave a comment, like the video, and you can subscribe to my channel for more of this and other strategy game content. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.